Great.
I'm good.
One of the things that I'm hoping that we continue to bring into our gatherings together is to remember that it's not only us and the community and the work that we do, but how we're incorporating nature in our work as well. I'm happy to report that I wrote one of our first grants. I've written 2 grants for the Ethical Society already. And one of them we already won, a very tiny micro grant from Earth Force and Chipotle. And the purpose of this is to talk about how our food choices impact CO2 emissions. And this will be done with our Sunday school, but we're going to be handing out storage containers to people and little plates from the USDA talking about proper portions and things like that, so we can cut down, because as it turns out, 1/3 of the food that you purchase ends up in the garbage can. And if you think about it, that's probably true. You probably go through your refrigerator quite a bit throwing things away. So 1/3, most of our food is high carbon impact, and we can make a difference on that. So that's what this grant's going to be about. And thanks to Earth Force, which is an environmental organization in California, and Chipotle, which is a restaurant chain across the United States, for their work. So thanks for that. I'm going to share my screen, yeah. Apologies as I share my screen. Did it come up? Great. There we go. One of the things that we've been exploring since I was here as an interim and then going forward is to think about what is our ethics and how our ethics works. And it's much more complicated. And it's good to take time to just, we're always talking about what's going on in the world and the things we should do, to talk about the frames that we use. And there are many, right? So there are, even within this room, I would imagine that there are different ways of looking at our ethics and understanding what they are. We started with the family service this morning, and I invite you, you're also welcome. It's family and friends. It's a family-friendly format, so there's a lot more moving around and game playing and things like that. But the question is, for me and for a lot of us, is how do we raise within our children kind of an ethical framework as well? We know that children are born with certain kinds of inert or inside beliefs about ethics. That's why they can stand there and stomp their feet when they get words and say, but that's not fair. So they have that kind of sense of the morality that's going on there. But we also know that that develops as they get older and older. And so how do you cultivate an ethical personality? It's a really, really kind of an interesting question when you think about it. And people have been looking into this for a long time. And so I thought this morning, and going with our conversation about our ethics, is to think about how do you develop an ethical personality, which is quite the challenge. In 1838, Horace Mann there was the Department of Education in Massachusetts, and he started what was called the Common School movement. You got to remember that even in the 1920s, education was not compulsory in this country beyond the 8th grade, right? So even in the 1920s, there were only 19 states there where kids were forced to go to school much later than that. And for most kids, they did not. Horace Mann in 1838 formulated for Massachusetts and then for the U.S. government kind of what would be the goals of education early on, because he thought that's something that we all needed to do to unite together. And I have to tell you that some of the roots of some of the early ideas may have been racist. They were afraid of parochial education, mostly by Catholics, who were kind of coming in with their own schools, and they thought that that would take it away from the character of the nation. But it was an interesting question for him, is what do we teach in school? So we always know that schools used to do writing, reading, and arithmetic, right? The 3 R's, we call them. And that's what they learned. But Horace in 1838 said that we also need to have a moment of moral education within the schools. What's interesting about this is that he was a Unitarian, and some of the early Christians accused him of trying to boil down the essences of their religion and that how important other things were, like salvation or perhaps following kosher rules or things like that, that you couldn't separate those things out for those groups. But Horstman thought that you could, and that somehow we could boil down what it is that we believe and that we could somehow raise within our children these kind of ideas. This has been a struggle, and we've had this conversation before, in this country for a long time. And there are divisions between the right and the left about how we should do this. Under George Bush, you remember, William Bennett was the Secretary of Education, and William Bennett thought that what we needed is the book of moral virtues, as he called it, is that we needed to go back to teach kids little morality stories where at the end there's an answer and the kids are supposed to memorize that answer. My colleague Arthur Dobrin, who was an ethical culture leader in Long Island for many years, and my colleague at Hofstra said the problem with that is rote memorization doesn't do anything for moral development, right? You're not really teaching kids how to think about things. You're saying, here's the story, here's the moral of the story, you should get that. And he was really against those things. We often forget that Adler, if you look across the United States, the thing that he is known most for is not ethical culture, but education. And in fact, you can find his books still online. Look at the source of this bookstore, Walmart, that great institution of morality in this country. But they're still also selling Adler's book, The Moral Instruction of Children. In fact, if you're like me and you're kind of an Adler geek and you set your computer to capture any news or any scientific journals, a large number of scientific journals and articles and college dissertations and books have been written about Felix Adler's educational approach. He's still well known in that area, and you can find still all of his books on education online. The problem is that when you read them, they're definitely written in this kind of style, of Victorian style of language that he had, which are somewhat kind of difficult to take. But if you listen to what Adler is trying to say, and this is what made this book so unique in 1898, is that he did not want to just have moral education in schools to be rote memorization. He also saw early on that that would be a problem. But what he was wondering is that at each stage, as children develop, their ability to understand and reason through ethics and participate in ethical discussion also develops. And he followed those for many youth and tried to figure out what is it that at each stage they were able to do. He thought there were scores of stages that kids went through in their kind of moral development. But for him, the kind of the highest level in a way was that quote, he was trying to explain at the end, that Esther wrote about the need to place yourself in the positions of others, to work with others, to not make judgment about them, to try and kind of lift them up. And that in that process, something happens to both the person who is receiving the care and then for us as well. If you're a fan of Paulo Freire's work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed from Brazil, you may find similar kinds of things in there as well. Of course, in this country, we had quite a well-known scientists and researchers who have looked at this question of moral development. We've talked about this man before, Lawrence Kohlberg, who kind of thought we all went through various stages of our own moral development, from very, very young children who may say, as you can see on the screen there, that it's really about obedience and punishment, right? I'm not going to do this because mom and dad are going to get mad or because they award me somehow. And we go as we age and mature through these stages. Now, Lawrence Kohlberg heavily drew his work from a man named Jean Piaget, which you probably know, who also thought that cognitively youth went through several stages. Neither one of these men studied more than a few children, which is amazing. They developed their entire theories based on the observation of like 7 youth, which becomes a problem when we talk about later on. It's amazing how little they use. But Lawrence Kohlberg did say, it's interesting if you present moral dilemmas, called the Kohlberg dilemmas, us, and you present them consistently to young kids, that at each age, they almost predictably you can get the answers to they got. And he thought that that was interesting until we start reaching about the age 4. Now, Kohlberg thought many of us don't ever make it past stage 3 very well. 4 is even more rare, and by the time you get to the 6th, which is to think of abstract principles, and he thought that that was the highest stage of moral development, but that somehow you would help with youth to kind of get these things, to think about how do you process till we get to that higher stage. Now, the mistake Lawrence Kohlberg made, and he made a couple of them, I think it's because this was beginning research like Adler. He was kind of finding his own way and basing his work also on a person who didn't do a large numbers of studies, is that Kohlberg found that young ladies typically stopped at age 3, and he would rarely see it, but he could see young men making it up to stage 6. And so therefore, he said women didn't have the ability that men had to think of abstract reasoning principles. Now, some of the women are already coughing in the room because that sticks in their craw, I'm sure, as it does for many of us as well, that we have a problem with that. Why is it, though, that if he were true, that young men tend to think of abstract principles, but the young ladies didn't? And that brings us to kind of our next figure here, which you all know is just Carol Gilligan, who looked at this research and kind of wrote her own book on that called It in a Different Voice. How many of you have read this book or seen it? Anyone in this audience? A few of you? Yeah, it's been around for a long time. She's looking at what Kohlberg thinks are the highest levels of moral development about how we should act. And she says, why do you say that? Why do you say it's better to be at an abstract level and arrive at those abstract principles rather than where the young ladies were? I told you that Kohlberg used a bunch of what are called Kohlberg dilemmas. And the most famous one is about Hans, whose wife is sick. He goes to the pharmacist. The pharmacist says, you can get this medicine, but it's very expensive. And Hans doesn't have the money. So what should Hans do? And that's one of the things that he would give to the crowd. And eventually, the young boys, as they got mature, would say, well, it's better that we have a society that cares for people in the abstract, or at least cares for people, and therefore it's okay that he maybe even breaks the window or not breaks the window because he also thinks in justice, but he had some kind of an abstract things. And I told you that according to Carol Gilligan's own work, the young ladies would say, well, why did the pharmacist say that? Well, why did has the pharmacist met the wife? What's the pharmacist's reason? Is there other way they can get around it? And the women focused almost extensively on the relationship between Hans, his wife, and the pharmacist to work out the details without coming to there. So Carol Gilligan in her book says that, why is it that Lawrence Kohlberg says it's abstract principles that are more important, when really what may be just as important is our capacity to care and develop relationships. We've made value choices of which is better, but really ultimately which is better. And she thought that women kind of had this natural capacity to care for one another, and actually that was a better ethical approach than just seeing if we can arrive at abstract principles of universal principles and things like that. In fact, she inspired the work of Nell Noddings, who wrote this famous book called Carrying a Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Development, Moral Education. She heavily influenced, Nell Noddings did, many of us across the United States who went into education, and thinking about that, about how do you teach caring? Maybe that's we can present moral stories and have kids come up with abstract principles and reasoning, or we could just teach people to care, and that whole process of the give and take between that is a better approach. So it's set up within this country in about the 80s, this kind of argument about what is better, this kind of going as William Bennett was saying with the moral principles things and Lawrence Kohlberg, or with our capacity to care. This woman here, Carol Tavris, wrote this book, The Mismeasure of Women, kind of if you based on the Mismeasure of Man book by Stephen Gould. She comes back, she says, I think that's not quite true. And she's critiquing both groups, but also Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings. And she's saying, actually, that probably it has very little to do with our innate abilities between gender, and more to do with the context that we put young boys and young girls in. that we often relegate young ladies into kind of a caring, nurturing role. That's a role that they typically see in the feminization of things like nursing and teaching and things like that, and those things. And in fact, that if you put men in those same roles and you change the context, men are just as likely to push for caring than the women would have done previously. And she looked at groups of people who actually had secretaries of either a dominant male with a female secretary or a dominant female with a male secretary, and what roles and what they did. And usually in both those situations, the secretaries were reminding people, oh, don't forget it's your wife's anniversary. I've already got the flowers together for you. Oh, don't forget to send the birthday party out to your coworker, announcements and things like that, and took care of those things. And Carol says, Tavris, that it really is the context, the power dynamics, and that's really what we should work on. And so we should teach children to be aware of how those things play out, how we set up systems that allow people to be fair, how we set up things that make sure that are create even the ways of being in the room, rather than having this once again, white male stand in front of you and deliver long talks, the way that we even operate as an ethical society, which is an interesting question about how we explore ethics. And so she's going to put a lot on here about the power of context that really, really shapes that. And that if people got better at context, we'd get better at kind of some of the differences that we see in our moral development of young children. Which kind of leads me to this guy. And I've mentioned him many, many times. That's like if Santa showed up at the Last Supper picture, I think. That's Robert Sapolsky, who I think is absolutely totally brilliant. He wrote that book there called Behave. He's a neuroscientist. And what he's actually pointing out is, if you think about, if you go back even 20 to 50,000 years ago, if a human hurt another human, they probably weren't looking at this as a moral transgression, right? If a great ape bites another ape, that ape who got bitten is probably not thinking, well, that's a moral transgression I need to deal with, right? That whole process of how humans respond is actually driven from a lot within our own biology. What Sapolsky says is that we are the symbolic animal, and then actually we then project within what's going internally into ourselves and upon others. He says that if you take the entire history of humanity and imagine it as a clock, we've only been with other people who are not our tribe in the last 5 minutes, right? So if you take all of human history, and you think from our earliest development, 50,000 years, where you could recognize what a human looked like about 100,000 years ago. But he says if you take the last 50 to 20,000 years ago, when we really started developing maybe early cultures, that we were not with others, right? We were with our tribe, we were with our little clan, and we were surviving together. And that whole notion of people coming together and work in cities, if that were clock, would only be in the last 5 minutes of that time together. So we are actually not good, he said, at still unpacking the fact that there's so much inside of us that is driven by these innate feelings. For example, take oxytocin, one of the things that we release into our brain that makes, it's lovely. That's what supposedly when a woman is gazing at her baby for the first time, sometimes what happens is their body is flooded with oxytocin, right? And it causes pair bonding. When people first fall in love, they're releasing large amounts of oxytocin and they're pair bonding. And some people would say that's all we need to do. We should just go around and spread more, oxytocin around. We'll all be better. But he says actually that's not true. Oxytocin is also what makes us look at the other and go, who are you people and what are you doing with my baby, and you should go away, right? Oxytocin in our own system can have two opposite impacts. In fact, what it's good at is actually saying us versus them. Right? He said we do this with our brain within milliseconds, that we come up with a decision that you are not us, and we make differences. And he says if you look across cultures, and including sometimes in our own society, you'll see where we have really wild differences between each other about what we see and how we react. And he says that's actually biologically driven. That we do that not because necessarily of some abstract principles, but he would argue that it's driven by our own biology. Now, he says the interesting thing about that is that the antidote for that is to think about who is us and who is them. In fact, they did experiments where they would have people look at other pictures and say kind of who is us and who is them, and they had complicated ways of doing that. And if people looked different from you, if they weren't the same race, the same gender, you were less likely to include them with an us, right? And then they secretly gave them some oxytocin, and sure, it was even more pronounced. You know, you're definitely not us, and you're definitely with us. In fact, they did this with morphing pictures of the difference between Israeli people and Japanese people, and they had pictures they could morph where they'd slowly change the figure, and so you start looking more maybe Asian, or you'd maybe look more Middle Eastern. And people made this big jump until they gave them oxytocin, sneaked it to them, and they really said, no, those people are not us. They look really different. And they could see the subtleties in the picture much earlier. Unless you do something remarkable like put a Yankees cap on the other person. And immediately, we identify that other person as part of us, right? Or you know, versus the Red Sox or whatever you want to say. New York Giants, and y'all have to tell me all your teams. I haven't even learned them all. So that something, it is innate with us to show difference, unless we always continue to think of ourselves as connected together. And that for him, it also has to do with context, but we have to recognize our own innate biology, and that drives us. And we have to kind of move beyond those things. And he thought the best way to do that was through habits. Let's just act as if something is not true. And if you get in the habit of it, you can actually suppress in a way even our own biology, because that's just the thing we do. And regardless of what that person looks like or how we act, if we consistently do those things, our body responds. For example, people in New York, if they see someone who looks different, their little indicator bells don't go off the same way as they would from where I'm from in rural South Texas, right? Who doesn't see this kind of difference you do? I had a conversation with my friends in Texas, and they said, what's it like living in New York? And I said, people there are very brave. And of course, they all got offended because, you know, they think they're brave and all that kind of stuff. And New Yorkers squeal when they see a bug. And I said, the difference is someone could walk down the street with purple hair, wearing cellophane, a gown, and, you know, piercings all over, kind of stuff. And you may look at them and you kind of look away and keep going as well. Whereas in Texas, you're here to destroy my way of life. You know, they see a person walk down the street. You're coming to destroy me. You know, and you're taking away everything I want and everything I love. And that's just something we do. And that what Sapolsky is saying is to understand that that's biologically driven deep inside of us. We need to be aware of these things. So we kind of have these choices then, and I gave you kind of 4 of them here, and I'm sure there's others. You know, we could just teach our children about reason principles and make sure they have better insights, that they're reasoning through problems and thinking through them. We can focus on caring relationships to get them to be better carers and better nurturers, and thinking about the cares and needs and working on the relations regardless of how we think about the ethics of what's going on. Or we could just get our youth to think about contextual things, that we know that people who don't have adequate health care, who people don't have adequate places to live, that people don't have adequate housing, that these things also impact how we respond to society. And actually, you know, that's that famous study of people in Europe, that the more of a safety net you built in, the less religious they become. Right? You would think people are highly religious, but in countries where there is a huge social security net, and they saw it over time, that they were religious countries, and all of a sudden now had universal health care, now they had free education, now they have free housing, and they have this huge social security net, that those groups went down religious. And so maybe it's something more about that. Or it's just internally driven and we have responses to stimuli, and that what we need to do with the youth is just to build up habits of being around others, habits of doing out there and going to work, and so that their first response is not the biologically driven one. So I'm going to take a second and say, where do you come down on this yourself personally? How would you kind of use these things? Because there's no right answer. I don't think, unless you think there is, and you're one of them. No kidding. But I wanted to see if there are some comments from the both us and the audience about which would you do. What do you think is the best? And maybe some combination of above. But where do you stand on this? So we're going to pass around the mic. Anyone in the room have a point? Okay, David.
Only that I think intellectual exercises with kids fails. I think it needs to somehow be experiential, because it makes you feel it. And I want to just relate something. There's a new book out about Hitler's first 100 days, and the author makes the point that even though the total number of Nazis in Germany was never anywhere near 50%, they would have thousands of people going into a little town and staging a rally, and it gave the entire town the impression that everybody in the country must be supporting him, and that it worked particularly well with the youth.
Thank you, David. Others? What would you do in this scale? What would you emphasize? What would you emphasize more? Or do you have something else?
We have three hands on Zoom.
Okay, we'll take one more in the room and then go to Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the most important things, and this perhaps comes under the last, best controlled by habits, is that it really has to be a very practical education. And so, you talk about putting young people and putting ourselves in a circumstance where we will have to face or, do an ethical challenge or express our ethical values. And I know with my son, a lot of times I'll just drag him along when I'm going to do some kind of community activity, whether it's a beach cleanup or, all kinds of different things. And he might not really even understand, like, well, what is he doing this for? But he's doing it. And I think for me, I trust that ultimately he will understand what he's doing it for. And at that point, all of these things that he's been doing become internalized. And so the practice becomes who he is.
Great. All right, we'll take two from Zoom.
Can you stop sharing so we can put the...
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, Paolo, please unmute yourself.
I don't think I was the first.
Nope, it's okay. I'm calling you first, though. We have
Okay.
not heard your voice very often in platform.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking, I remember reading a few years ago a book called Embodied Moral Psychology and Confucian Philosophy. And in it, one of the examples that I remember that was really interesting was talking about how Confucius, I'm pretty sure it was Confucius, giving an example of a child sitting on the side of a well, that you don't sort of sit around and think about sort of abstract principles of right and wrong. You just immediately lunge for the child and grab them away from the edge of the well. And so I always thought that was kind of interesting that, even someone who's like an actual philosopher thinking about a lot of abstract topics was still talking about that kind of relational form in day-to-day life.
Thank you. Pam, please unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you very much. I have one simple comment. I believe that if we were to teach our children morality from a very young age, we would have a lot less bullies in school, a lot less shootings, nonsensical shootings, and a lot more peace between children if we were to start teaching morality at the youngest age that possibly could. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Curt, we have two more on Zoom.
Go ahead, take another one.
Okay, go ahead, unmute yourself, Elaine and/or Dan.
So a couple of things. One, among the four choices that I wouldn't call them choices because they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but the four sort of themes of ethical education that Curt posted in his last slide, I think to some extent it's an empirical question. I think one has to look and see which one or ones actually works by observing how people who've been raised in those different ways of doing things actually behave. But I also think that, look, and just personally, I think the biggest question is How do you get people to think of everyone else as part of their tribe rather than their little limited group? I think that seems, when I look at this country, to be the hardest thing, and not just this country. But the other issue is that I think an awful lot of, well, two things. One, Joe referred in a number of his platforms to the notion that empathy is fundamental to morality. And I know Curt, in effect, was touching on this earlier. And he pointed out that there have been some studies that show that even really, really little kids will empathize with each other. A kid sees another kid hurt, and before they learn to bully the other kid, they'll empathize with them. So the question of how one can build on that, I don't know the answers, but I wonder if these are the questions that we need to be thinking of. And last of all, I think an awful lot of this has to do not with what one is doing formally in schools, but it has to do with how one is raised in a family. And the challenge there is, how does the school or the religion or whatever counterweigh what's happening in the family if the family is not raising kids in a moral way? If the family is raising kids to be authoritarian or bullying, I think most of us would find that objectionable. Some families would think that's the height of morality. But if we really find that that's objectionable, then we have to ask, and again, I would say this is an empirical question, what's the best way of bringing kids who are coming from families like that into a different way of acting morally and ethically? And I say that because I know examples from my own family, my parents' generation, of people who behaved in extraordinarily ethical and moral ways without any formal ethical or moral training. No, we were not observant Jews, totally secular, no religious involvement, but extraordinary examples of ethical and moral behavior. So I think we have to look at all of those questions. And I think a lot of it, as I said, is empirical. I haven't read all the research. I haven't read any of the research. So I don't know which among these various things give some examples of what works. I have heard that people studying people who, in Germany, who saved Jews during the period of Nazi rule, came from all kinds of backgrounds, but there seemed to be, there was a famous study about this, a common theme that they came from families where the kids were taught to think for themselves about what's right and wrong, rather than families in which morality was dictated from above. Maybe that's a clue, just because it's empirical. But again, how one broadens that to education outside of the home, that I think is in some ways the $64,000 question. And I think it's one that needs to be studied empirically. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan.
But is there anyone else in the room? Okay, Lisa.
Yeah, just for me, as a parent, as a social worker, I would say it's all about caring and connection and relationships. And I was thinking, as Dan was talking, about the different families that children grow up in. And when I worked as a social worker in a school, part of my job was to do social histories to Mike, you're not hearing me, sorry. To understand where that child's coming from, the family background. And I would work very closely with the psychologists when we were running groups. So it's very, very important, I think, to understand where people are coming from, what their backgrounds are, and for us to be able to understand the actions of another, we have to understand where they're coming from. And there's so many examples of this. Kids who aren't nurtured. Let's just take a baby. What's most important when you're born? You have to care for that child, right? You have to love that child. You have to make a connection for that child to develop trust. So it really starts with caring, understanding, for us to get to any other point. So that's...
Thank you. We're going to take 3 more online, and I think we're running out of time. So let's start.
Okay, Mark Hecht, please unmute yourself.
Oh, hi, everybody. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. And it's funny because Dan and his conclusions was sort of what I was going to talk about, which was that, and also in the very beginning when Curt was talking about learning from Bennett's concept of a moral from an example, I think that you need to extrapolate from that and realize this isn't just a moral dilemma or dealing with a moral dilemma on how to teach children, but in general education. I think one of the problems that we have is we don't teach children to care or to think critically. And I don't think you can completely separate the two completely. I mean, at a young level, yeah, it's about maybe it's caring, but the thing I wanted to stress was that in general education, people are taught to learn by rote. And it seems as if Bennett was trying to use the same technique for moral education, just to learn by rote. But what I think is important, and I think some of the people had mentioned this, is to think we need to think critically and to be caring. And all the 4 principles that were enumerated on your chart, I think they're all interconnected on some level. But I think that's very important to add the idea of thinking dialectically, because I think that sort of summarizes the idea, and because that's like an overarching idea that if you can think dialectically, that would include caring and reasoning and the ability to contextualize all these things. But people, and especially in our kind of societies that we're living in, aren't taught to think dialectically. They think in terms of more naive scientific terms of just abstracting things and seeing things as separate from each other. And so they're not able to really evolve their thought. They just think very schematically without any kind of organic quality and being able to really grapple with an issue. So that's all I wanted to say, to teach the dialectical thinking, if that's possible. Maybe some people are not capable of that, but I think that people would have the ability, but it'd be a tough thing to be able to teach, and then to base it upon caring and reasoning, which goes back, to moral philosophy based upon emotions or based upon reason, and the other aspects that people have mentioned.
Thank you, Mark. Rachel Farrat, please unmute yourself.
I think the secret is that we need to teach all 4 ways. Partly because we don't know what will work for any individual that we're teaching, but also because our children are going to encounter people who work in all 4 ways. I think we each have a tendency, and whether that's biological or learned, I don't know, but Dan and I both received a lot of praise as children for any intellectual accomplishment. And so we tend to head in that direction. Solving problems is my love language, no question. But I think that's why it's so important to raise our children in a community, so that they are encountering all different kinds of people who address ethical issues in all different kinds of ways. And so that they're able to understand, first of all, that the people they meet may be communicating in a way that they're not used to, and they may need to learn to understand that, but also that for different situations, a different solution may be appropriate. And so I think it's about looking at where the individual child is strong and weak, and trying to bring up those areas that they may not naturally be drawn to, so that they can expand their brains and how they work.
Thank you, Rachel. Jessica Johnson, please unmute yourself.
Hey, everybody, thank you for giving me a chance to speak. I know I'm a guest here, but I thought it was very interesting, the little vignette about fear in Texas. And I can say firsthand that I agree with that. I grew up in New Jersey, and I grew up as the child of a Catholic and a Jew. So I was raised with lots of religion and told I had to have nothing. And then I moved to Kansas for 10 years, which is the heart of the Bible Belt, and is, if you've never been to Kansas, an extraordinarily homogeneous society. It's really, everybody is very, very similar. They have very similar worldviews, very similar viewpoints, and they have very little exposure to the outside world, and they're very insular. They really don't allow their children to experience the outside world in a way that is so alien to what we experience living in the Northeast. And when I went out there, I went to Kansas State University, which is the largest university in Kansas, and they pride themselves on their diversity. Like 2% of the population is graduate students from overseas. That's their diversity. And when I went out there, even though I blended in with the homogeneous majority, I was seen as the other because I was willing to consider other people's viewpoints. And I was vilified. I had friends who literally told me, my parents don't want me talking to you because you have friends that are other. And because just in my willingness to listen and my willingness to ask questions, I became the other. So I think one of the big things when we raise our children, and I have 2 young children, so this is something I've been considering a lot, we need to teach them not to be afraid of questions and not to be afraid of asking them, but also not to be afraid of answering them. Because I think that's what I saw when I went out to Kansas, when I would ask them a question about their worldview, and that was seen as an attack. So I think it's important to teach children that just because someone asks you a question, that you're not under attack. And to teach them that empathy and caring and compassion and concern is not just about your concern for others, but others' concern for you, and being able to have that dialogue 2 ways. And I think that's really critical to building this sense of ethics and value in society, is being able to understand that you need to not only be willing to be compassionate, but you need to let that person feel compassion for you and address them in such a way that you're not condemning their worldview in your attempt to understand them.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica, and we hope to hear your voice again. So thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to go back and share my screen one more second. You know, like I said, Adler was pretty amazing. Why people still read him is that when in the 1800s, people were asking for moral education, it was kind of the rote memorization stuff. And suddenly he publishes a book in 1898, 1889, excuse me, was still pretty early, basically saying, no, that's really not going to lead to moral children. That really what has to happen is you have to be able to create their ability to think. Adler in that same book says, I'm not interested in raising ethical automatons, right? We don't want children who just parrot us and have no internal reason to ability to think those things. He also thought that ethics didn't need to concern itself with everything that we do in our lives, right? If people dress differently or walk differently or eat differently, all this kind of stuff, and though we would say that that has an impact on our planet, he says that's not the stuff of ethics. And in that book, he says one of his most famous quotes is that ethics is the science of right relations. And then that's what we're trying to figure out. And if we get children to think about anything, it's just to think about their relationships. And that's why I asked Esther to read that. And if you look at even, as I said, how he looks at charity. So I think if I boil down, and I'm trying to think of the family programming here and this type of stuff, you know, where do we go from here? Oops, 1 second, technical difficulties. Stop and reshare. You know, what he tries to put in his book, and there's the kind of the plate for it, is that what we need to do, and there's many of those echoed in this room, that it has to be in a sense of community. It has to have where youth are thinking about things, they're putting themselves in other roles, that it has to respond to the cognitive stages, that obviously if they're little kids, we're just going to tell them, no, don't do that, stop hitting someone. We're not going to sit down and reason with a little kid about those things. He thought that's just the stage that we're at, what they're in. But he also then predicts that there would be all these other stages that we had to think about the best way to bring those youth in there. And kind of boiling together all these things are kind of the things that were said in this room, which is to make ethical actions a habit. That's the famous work of the psychologist who looked at people who worked in soup kitchens, both those who did it short term because they felt like a good thing to do, and those who were there every single month. And they discovered that those who did it every single month, when they asked them why they did it, they said, well, that's just what I always do. My parents made me do it. I don't know, that's just what you do, right? They had already this habit, kind of what Robert Sapolsky is saying, that a lot of what we need to do is just to make sure that our youth are out there just doing these kinds of stuff and making them. But they're also working to building an increasingly and better environment or culture that we do respond to stimuli around us, right? That if we have unhealthy environments, we have poverty, we have those things that may force ethical choices that youth are trying to make. And we want to make sure that they understand those roles and how we impact them and how we can continue to improve them. But also just to diminish that power we have around the world, and including in the United States, the power of the us versus them, which is biologically driven and is very deep within us by affirming the worth and dignity of others and eliciting their capacity to care. And if I think about what Adler was trying to do, I think that's the kind of the message that he was getting. I hope you'll join us on our Sunday morning, sometimes at 9:45. We'll be introducing these things with our youth for a variety of things. That's only every other week. And then every other the week are actually going on ethical adventures. So they're going outside the building, or they're going to do ethical actions. And those could be inside or outside the building. So it's a combination of venturing out the community, meeting others, traveling as a commuter, thinking and reflecting on those things, working for projects and things like that, and kind of creating this rich environment for our young adults. And I hope you think that's great, and I hope to hear from you if you think it can be improved. I'm a big fan of art. If you come back here in a couple of weeks, you'll hear me talk about art. I love art, and I love thinking about art, and I love, I go to people's houses and I notice their art. I had dinner with David and Susan again, and I'm always telling him they should have this appraised or have that appraised because I think it's much more valuable. It's not all about the money, by the way. Piet Mondrian, some of you probably know, also known as Pieter Mondrian. You probably have seen this art or versions of his art over in New York City. And people go, I just don't get this art. And what's interesting, he created a movement called the style, right? About these things, about what he was trying to do. And he was a part of a group of artists who at this period were looking at art in new ways. And they thought, hey, listen, when is it when we look at one painting, we say that's art, but we look at something else, we say that's not. And they thought that there may be something universal to the art, right? If you strip away its design, you strip away the color, that there's something about a form, or there's something about a movement, or something about a subject that's the most important part. And what he said is, I can reduce that just to 3 colors, which he painted in 3 colors, and just the placement of lines. He says, I believe it is possible, this is him speaking, Piet Mondrian, that through horizontal and vertical lines constructed with awareness, but not with calculation, led by high intuition and brought to harmony and rhythm, these basic forms of beauty, supplemented if necessary by other direct lines or curves, can become a work of art, as strong and as true. And that, like Henry Moore and his sculptures, they were all trying to unpack what is the language, the hidden thing of art. Now, not all artists agreed with him, but it's an interesting what they were trying to do, that somehow when people could look at this and say, no, there was something very artistic about that in its shape, its form, its design. And I think for us as ethical culturists, that's what we hope to discover. What is the deep thing inside of us that connects us together? The language, the shapes, the ways of being, that when we're together, we say that's ethical. We can say that that's ethical, even though we don't quite have the words for it. And it's a combination between thinking, feeling, intuition, and sometimes maybe it's just part of the art of being ethical. Thank you all very much.